Here is the thing nobody wants to say out loud. The largest drone and missile barrage launched against Ukrainian civilians in months happened on the exact same day Russian officials were broadcasting their most vocal calls for peace talks. Over 1,500 aerial threats, 60-plus missiles. And the timing was not accidental. That is not a news story. That is a confession. The media will frame this as escalation, as a provocation, as a response to battlefield pressure. But here is what they are not telling you. The gap between what Moscow says and what Moscow does has become so wide that it is no longer a contradiction. It is a strategy. And once you understand that strategy, everything else, the ceasefires, the summits, the diplomatic theater, snaps into focus in a way that should make you deeply uncomfortable. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell because this situation changes every single day and you need to be here when it does. Let us start with the number that explains everything. Roughly 1,200 to 1,500 Russian casualties per day. That figure comes from Ukrainian military intelligence and has been corroborated by independent NATO assessments. Run that forward across a calendar year and you are looking at more than 400,000 personnel losses. Russia's total active military strength stands at approximately 1.3 million. Do that arithmetic slowly, because that is not an abstraction. That is an existential clock, and it is ticking inside the Kremlin, whether they admit it or not. Here is what that number means concretely. Russia's prison population has declined by roughly 40% since the invasion began. Those men were not released. They were conscripted, sent to the front with minimal preparation, minimal equipment, and no realistic path back. And here is the part that almost no analyst mentions. The replacement pool is not just shrinking in size. It is collapsing in quality. Early in the war, Moscow could draw on trained reserve personnel, men who understood tactics and command structure. Now it is pulling civilians out of their lives and deploying them within weeks. The force is degrading from the inside, even as its nominal headcount holds. That is why the territorial situation has shifted. Not because Ukraine has solved its own manpower problems, it has not, but because the Russian army's capacity for sustained offensive operations has fallen below the threshold required to hold, let alone gain, ground. So what does a military machine do when it can no longer win on the battlefield? It demonstrates that it can still hurt. It shifts from victory to punishment. Think of it this way. Imagine a business that has lost every major contract, is burning through its reserves, and cannot win a new client. What does its management do? It does not close. It does not admit failure. It calls a press conference and announces a bold new vision. It makes noise. It projects confidence. It performs strength because actual strength is no longer available. That is what the strikes on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure represent. The apartment block near a major airport approach road, the power substations in the west, the fuel depot in Kremenchuk. These are not military targets. They are demonstrations. They say, we cannot take your territory, but we can still reach your homes. We cannot defeat your army, but we can still kill your civilians. We cannot win, but we can make winning cost you everything. And here is the mechanism that makes this so dangerous, that demonstration is itself evidence of failure. A genuinely winning power does not need to terrorize apartment buildings. A confident strategic actor does not need to shell a children's playground to prove a point. The very necessity of the strike reveals the bankruptcy of the position behind it. But none of this happens in isolation. There is a political architecture sustaining it, and that architecture is where the real story lives. Vladimir Putin has spent years constructing a specific mythology around himself and around Russia's role in the world. The restorer of greatness, the man who defied Western unipolarity, the leader who bends history to his will. That mythology is not decoration. It is load-bearing. It is what holds the domestic political coalition together. It is what keeps the security establishment loyal, what keeps the propaganda apparatus functioning, what keeps the regional governors in line. And here is the trap. That mythology cannot survive a negotiated settlement that leaves Ukraine independent and NATO intact. It cannot survive a frozen conflict that looks like stalemate. It cannot survive a ceasefire that the outside world reads as Russian failure. So he cannot stop. Not because stopping is militarily impossible, but because stopping is politically unsurvivable for him personally. This is what it means to be strategically cornered, not surrounded by enemy forces, surrounded by the consequences of your own narrative. So the strategy has 4 components, and they are worth naming clearly. The first is delay and exhaust. The goal is not to win this summer. The goal is to survive until winter and then use cold and darkness as weapons. Strikes on energy infrastructure are not tactical responses to battlefield events. They are a deliberate campaign to make Ukrainian civilians choose between resistance and warmth. The window for this strategy runs until roughly October, when summer temperatures make grid disruption less lethal. That is Putin's operational clock on this front. The second is to bet on Western fracture. Moscow is not gambling on military victory. It is gambling on political fatigue, on coalition drift, on the possibility that some combination of American unpredictability, European economic anxiety, and Chinese equivocation creates a diplomatic opening wide enough to slip through. This is not confidence. It is desperation with a strategy attached. The third is to manufacture internal Ukrainian chaos. Legal proceedings, political detentions, the targeting of senior officials, these are not coincidental. They are an attempt to flood the zone, to distract Ukrainian decision-making, to create the internal noise that makes coherent resistance harder to sustain. The fourth and most important is what we might call the false peace operation, a coordinated diplomatic performance designed to appear reasonable while the bombs fall. The logic is precise. If Russia says it wants negotiations and Ukraine refuses, then in the narrative war, Ukraine becomes the obstacle to peace. Western publics tire, pressure shifts from Moscow to Kyiv. And suddenly the question is not whether Russia should stop invading, but whether Ukraine should stop resisting. That framing is not accidental, it is engineered. And the proposed ceasefires fit the same logic. A 72-hour pause does not allow Russia to manufacture new missiles, but it does allow conserving existing stockpiles. It allows resting and resupplying ground forces. It allows satellite reconnaissance to update target lists. It allows loading drone platforms to maximum capacity. When the pause ends, the strikes resume with greater precision and greater intensity. A loading period dressed as a humanitarian gesture. This is not peace vocabulary. It is war vocabulary in a diplomatic costume. Now let us talk about the clocks, because there are multiple timelines running simultaneously, and they are not synchronized. Russia has several clocks running against it at once. The manpower clock we already discussed. The economic clock, official military spending, is somewhere around 6% of GDP, but independent estimates run significantly higher, and the ruble has weakened, inflation has increased, and sanctions have effectively cut off the technology imports that a modern military economy requires. The internal political clock, there is no mass public dissent in Russia. State information control prevents that, but there is evidence of elite anxiety, war fatigue in conscription-heavy regions, and a growing disconnect between what the propaganda apparatus claims and what military commanders actually know. These clocks do not run at the same speed, but they are all running. Ukraine, by contrast, has one primary clock, the sustainability of international support, and that clock is running slower than Putin's internal clocks. American support has remained more durable than anticipated across multiple political cycles. European support has actually increased as the continent's own threat calculus has shifted. The structural asymmetry here is not in military capacity, it is in time. Ukraine has more of it than Moscow currently believes. Inside Russia, the regime is not monolithic, even if it appears so from outside. The security and military establishment benefits from the war economy and has every incentive to continue, but also has the clearest view of what is actually happening at the front. The business elite has been partially insulated from the worst consequences and has found alternative trading relationships, but questions about sustainability are beginning to circulate in private. Regional administrations are managing increasingly aggressive conscription quotas and increasingly hostile civilian reactions. The propaganda apparatus is the most committed to the mythology of inevitable victory, because admitting failure means admitting its own irrelevance. These factions do not openly conflict. But pressure from outside, sanctions, continued military aid to Ukraine, diplomatic isolation, makes their internal contradictions more acute. It strengthens the factions that are questioning the war and weakens the ones that profit from its continuation. This is why sustaining pressure is not simply a moral position. It is the mechanically correct response to the actual situation inside Russia. Now, let us be direct about what negotiations actually mean in this context, because the framing matters. When Moscow says it is open to talks, it means Ukraine accepts territorial losses obtained through invasion, agrees to limit its own military capacity, and effectively surrenders its sovereign right to choose its own security arrangements. When Moscow says Ukraine is invited to the table, it means come and ratify your defeat. When Moscow says the continuation of the war is Ukraine's choice, it means stop resisting and the bombing will stop. That is not negotiation. It is coercion with diplomatic language applied to the surface. And there is a structural asymmetry that makes this even more complicated. An autocrat can accept a settlement that looks like victory to his domestic audience because he controls what his domestic audience sees. He can declare success, adjust the historical record, and move on. A democratic leader cannot do that. Any territorial concession is visible, debatable, subject to a free press and a political opposition. Zelensky cannot negotiate away Ukrainian land without political consequences that would cost him the mandate to govern. The narrative constraints are different. The political costs are genuinely different. And this is why pressure toward compromise falls asymmetrically. It lands on the side that has less room to absorb it. What we are witnessing right now is not the behavior of a strategic planner executing a coherent long-term vision. It is the behavior of a political actor who has invested everything in a single narrative, watched that narrative encounter reality, and is now cycling between maximum violence and maximum diplomacy in the hope that something breaks before the internal clocks run out. Exhausted autocrats are historically at their most dangerous precisely at this moment, when the gap between the public mythology and the private reality becomes impossible to paper over. The temptation is to reach for the most extreme available option, not because it is strategically sound, but because it is the only move left that the mythology can accommodate. The strikes on civilian infrastructure are not a sign of strength. They are a sign that conventional military strategy has failed to deliver, and that what remains is the capacity to punish rather than the capacity to prevail. The response then is not complicated, even if it is difficult. Do not lift the pressure. Do not signal that the coalition is tired. Do not allow the framing to shift from Russian aggression to Ukrainian intransigence. Because the moment outside actors signal openness to Russian terms, the moment the conversation moves from how Ukraine wins to what Ukraine should concede, that is the moment Putin's calculation changes. That is the moment the trap he has built around himself begins to open. The only leverage that exists is cost. As long as the cost of continuing exceeds what the internal clocks can absorb, the pressure holds. The moment the cost drops through reduced aid, lifted sanctions, diplomatic normalization, the calculus inverts. There is no version of this where appeasement produces stability. History has been generous with examples of this lesson and has never once changed the conclusion. The strikes of the past weeks were not the climax of this story. They were the middle section, the evidence of a cornered position, not a winning one. What happens next will be determined not by what Moscow does, it has already shown its hand, but by whether the outside world maintains clarity about what it is actually looking at. And what it is looking at is not a peace process, it is a pressure test. Drop your analysis in the comments below. Do you believe the internal Russian clocks are running faster than Western support is likely to hold? We read every response,